Before I start this video, I really must give you some background information on this home site we're about to metal detect. I've been looking for this spot for a few years now and just recently found it by accident. There is a story about this home that I'll include at the end of the video, but for now I'll give you the basics. The rumor is a woman fell in her well and drowned at this spot. She is supposedly buried on the property. I did find 2 stones that both look like cemetery stones. Maybe one is hers. The woman's name was Rachel, and she lived here in the early 1800s. One day while her husband was working in the field, he heard her scream, and when he went back to see what was wrong, he found her in the well. He buried her close by on the property. According to legend, every year on the anniversary of her death, July 17th, you could hear her scream. This happened until her husband finally went to join her years later. Is it a rumor? Or could it be true? I'll leave that to you to decide. I tried to find more information on Jacob Moss or his wife, Lavinia, but I couldn't find any. I also couldn't find any information on Rachel Moss. I'm starting to think that perhaps their first names were changed for the story. What I did find is the last name, Moss, is an old and well-known last name in the area that Moss Wilderness is located. The Mosses first came to the northern Chenango County area, or the town of New Berlin, New York, in the late 1700s or early 1800s. Deacon Joseph Moss and his wife Rhoda Moss were the first Mosses to come to the area close to Moss Wilderness. Deacon Moss and Rhoda had 9 children. Their first child, Caleb, was born in Hartwick, New York, in 1797. Hartwick is just shy of 20 miles from New Berlin. Their second child was Truman, born 1801 in New Berlin. Meaning the Mosses must have made the 20-mile trip to settle in New Berlin between 1797 and 1801. This fits with what the story says about Rachel and her husband coming to northern Chenango County in the late 17th, early 18th century. A short article about Deacon Moss states, Joseph Moss was born September 8, 1775, and was one of the early settlers of the town of New Berlin. In 1812, when the Farmers and Mechanics Manufacturing Company was chartered, he became its agent. Under his supervision, the dam across the Unadilla in New Berlin Village was built, and a canal was constructed from it to the place of business, a small wooden building which stood on the site of the new grist mill, where the manufacture of cotton cloth was begun. The yarn was spun by water power machinery, but wove into cloth by hand, as water power looms were not then in use. Weavers from near and distant neighborhoods were employed to weave the yarn into cloth and performed the labor at their homes. The business increased to such an extent, and in 1827 a large stone factory was erected and water power looms introduced to accommodate it. That building was destroyed by fire the same season and rebuilt in 1828, and the business was continued under the agency of Mr. Moss till 1849, when the business agency terminated. Mr. Moss died October 29, 1859. Horace Moss, son of Joseph, who during his father's agency in the cotton mill was engaged there as clerk, is the only child remaining here. An interesting note about Horace Moss. There is an old manor home in New Berlin named Preferred Manor, but also commonly known as the Horace Moss Manor House, named after its former owner, Horace Moss. A short article about the Horace Moss House or Preferred Manor. The Preferred Manor, also called the Horace Moss House, is one of just 2 stone houses in the village and is a stunning 19th-century American home built in 1831. The kitchen and servants' quarters from the 1800s are still in use. This manor was a stop on the Underground Railroad. The Preferred Mutual Insurance Company bought it in 1946, and it got added to the National Register of Historic Places on May 17, 1974. While the home has been updated with plumbing, central heating, and other modern comforts, the original architecture and basic structure are mostly intact. Now, the manor serves as a guest house for people staying overnight in the New Berlin area and has 5 guest rooms. The Ghost of Moss's Wilderness. And that scream came every July 17th, up until the year my grandfather died. The old gentleman had invited me in when I stopped to get a drink at the chain pump at the back door. My real reason for stopping was because a few weeks before a worker in a lumber yard had asked me if I had ever heard the story of the Ghost of Moss's Wilderness. He had told me that old Jake would tell me about it if I could get him to talk. The ghost was said to have been that of old Jake's grandmother, who once lived on what is now state-owned forest land in the northern part of Chenango and the southern end of Madison counties. Old Jake, now nearly 80, still lived in that neck of the woods, and might be persuaded to tell me the story. He was a nice old fellow, the workman confided, but quite touchy about his story. Some folks laughed at him, so Jake doesn't trust them anymore. But he never changes the story, my friend said. Some old folks enlarge on their memories, but not Jake. I am rather inclined to think there must be something to it. So I was off on another ghost story. A few Saturdays later, I was feeling my way through tangled woodsy roads that seemed to go nowhere. I was looking for Moss's Wilderness, but workmen on the Sylvan roads had never heard of it. A man splitting wood near a tumble-down house had heard tell of it a long time ago, but that was nigh on to 60 years ago. If the man I sought was named Moss, they must have come from farther to the north. Seems like he had heard of a settlement by that name once. It was a hot June day when I came into sight of a small house with a tall hedge around it. What attracted me most was the chain pump by the back door. Surely no one would object if a fellow took a drink with that tin cup on top of the pump. I had just started to turn the crank when an elderly man came around from the yard. "Help yourself," he said. "Water is free, but we don't have much else, in case you are selling something. If you're not a peddler, come up on the porch and set a while." I didn't ask him, but I seemed to sense that the man I was talking with was old Jake, and I liked him. We talked for a half hour, and the sun was getting high. I would soon have to be trying to find my way back. I must start to get that story. I understand there is an interesting ghost story about these parts, I ventured. Have you ever heard it? He sat still for a full minute. What did you say your business was? He asked. I decided to come clean. I was a newspaperman. Now could he tell me anything about that Ghost of Moss's Wilderness? I wasn't going to tell that story again, he said softly. Folks used to think I was lying to them. If I tell it to you, will you hear me through? Maybe Lavinia will make us a glass of lemonade. Been working in my garden all morning. He filled his pipe from a leather pouch. It was about my grandmother, he began. I guess I can tell it again. It seems that the incident took place just after the turn of the last century. His grandfather had brought his bride from the east to live on a farm he had received as a soldier. He built her a log house down yonder about where that oak tree stands, my narrator said. And beside it he dug a well and stoned it up. That well was filled in after the accident 150 years ago, but it is still there, with a sandstone curbing around it. I will show you later. It seems that one day, the 17th day of July, the grandfather, who was still a young man, was working in a field some distance from the well. Suddenly he heard a terrible scream that echoed as though someone was falling a considerable distance. The young farmer ran to the well and peered in. There at the bottom of the shaft, he saw through the dim light what seemed to be a white apron. Beside the well curb was a wooden pail. The young woman had just recovered from delivering a baby boy, had leaned over too far, and had fallen headlong into the well. The baby boy turned out to be old Jake's father. Grandfather buried Rachel up there on that hill yonder, Jake said, but he would go and sit all Sunday on the well curbing. I guess he loved her greatly. He never got over it. But the part of this story that folks don't believe was that each year on July 17th, folks heard the same identical scream coming from the well, the same kind of echoing scream as though someone was falling. And that scream came every July 17th up until the year grandfather died. We both sat still for several minutes. All that could be heard was the rhythmic creak of the old man's chair rocker. There could be no comment. I couldn't tell him I didn't believe it, because I didn't know. I needed time to think. We were both silent as he took me to see what was left of the well, a sandstone curbing with nasturtiums planted around it. It seemed almost like a holy place. We went back toward my car, pausing for another drink at the chain pump by the porch. Was the story that old Jake had told me true? Old Jake, who actually heard the ghostly screams from the old well shaft. He certainly believed it. Why couldn't I if I wanted to?